speaking of things that we didn't like and talking about characters, do we want to say his name at the same time?
Yeah, okay. 3, 2, 1. Christopher Walken.
He's so bad.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coffee Break, your favorite podcast for all things gaming, technology, movies, shows, fandoms, and more. With all of the exciting things happening in the Dune universe these days and the insane amount of hype surrounding it, we've decided to dive headfirst into the epic science fiction franchise, which will soon see its 60-year anniversary. With more than 20 novels to its credit, 3 feature films, a made-for-TV miniseries, and coming up on its 7th video game release, it's safe to say that the Dune franchise has captured the hearts and minds of its fans in ways that few other fandoms could ever hope to achieve. So there's a lot to get into, and we should probably get into it. Joining me as always is my partner in coffee, Marcos. What's up, man?
Hey, glad to be here.
All right, so I guess we should probably start with some background. 60 years, after all. When did you become a Dune fan? Has this always been something you were into, or did you hop on this most recent hype train with the release of the new movies?
So I've kind of been like a quasi-Dune fan before the hype train. I was interested in some of the games. I was passively interested in the book. Like I bought the book, haven't read it. But I knew it was a cool sci-fi franchise and I always like wanted to get into it. And then when the first movie came along, that was like my jumping on point. That was like where, okay, now's the time to get into this because I can go into it relatively spoiler free and have a fresh experience. So it was the perfect time to jump on, but I knew of Dune's existence before the movie, and it was just like, that was just a catalyst that like pushed me into getting into the franchise fully.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I can relate to that a bunch, because even though we may not have read the books, and I'm just going to go ahead and say, I have not read the books, it just somehow has been around for so long and made such an impact on popular science fiction culture that it has just been sort of an integral part of the sci-fi zeitgeist, throughout most of our life. So even if you hadn't read the book, you've been aware of it. I was aware of it. I am older than you. We won't go into any details. But I definitely had an awareness and played some of Dune 2, which was like early 1990s. And I think, just a shout out to that, I think that really put it into a whole new generation of fans that had never read the book, had never planned to read the book, never read the book afterwards, but have a love for the story and the universe from the game alone. And that game does not get enough credit for literally authoring the entire genre of RTS. The modern real-time strategy genre of gaming can really trace its roots directly back to Dune 2 on PC. And I have always had love for it for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely a game that was kind of on my radar. It was a bit before my time, but when you're looking at like classic games that you want to go back to, you have that little list in the back of your mind. This was definitely one of them where I was like, okay, I should go back and play this. But the new Dune Spice Wars is a phenomenal modern recreation of it. I've been playing that recently, and that just feels like so well done, man. It really encompasses the games universe and RTS, as a genre. And I've always loved RTS. I remember playing Supreme Commander and StarCraft and all those great ones. Oh, what's the other one that I liked?
Command and Conquer, Red
Command
Alert.
and Conquer, there you go.
Okay, so I do want to cover the games, and of course we will be covering the upcoming MMORPG survival game Dune Awakening, which is part of the enormous wave of Dune content that we've got coming pretty soon. So we'll get to video games eventually, but I think the first place to start has got to be the 1984 David Lynch Dune, the first iteration of an on-screen exposure to the Dune universe.
Greatest movie ever made.
Greatest movie ever made. Okay, so just to fill people in, we in our Discord community this last weekend streamed Dune 84 for everyone to see. We had a watch party of, maybe 10 people. Got to get an idea of what that's like. We wanted to do it in anticipation of this podcast, maybe contrast and compare to the new remakes and see how it holds up. I for one, was really excited to watch this because when you end up, and I had wanted to watch it after Dune 1, the remake, I found myself desperately craving more Dune. I mean, that's where I was at. I loved the movie so much. Spoiler if we're going to go into reviews here, but it was phenomenal. It really cut off abruptly. I think that's one of the things most people agree with the new Dune. And so I really wanted some more Dune story exposure. I was very excited to get into this movie. I was shocked at the cast. There's actually a lot of really good names in this movie, but it was maybe one of the more painful watching experiences I've had in the last, I don't know, few years. It was pretty. Did you like it? Did you enjoy this
Greatest movie of all time. I mean, it's number one.
Okay, nice.
It's replaced every other movie on the list. It's no, it was painful to sit through. And part of that is because it's an old movie, right? Like you go back and you watch most old movies, they don't hold up. There's a couple that do, that stand the test of time, but most old movies don't, due to the progression of 3D effects, all the acting has evolved in general.
I like that point. Yep.
Yeah, there's all kinds of reasons why older movies don't hold up. But this one, when you watch a bad movie, you can tell, okay, this was just bad even when it came out, right? And the
reviewers at the time would agree with you.
Yeah. And this was not a good movie. There are so many reasons. I think the biggest thing, if we want to dive straight into it, the pacing. The pacing is terrible. I think that's a big issue across a lot of media that we see today and in the past, but today in general, it's like the biggest sore thumb here, where they just squished an entire book into one movie. And honestly, it wasn't that long, right? Was it just under 2 hours?
I think it's just over 2 hours.
Just over 2 hours? Okay, just over 2:10, 2:16, something like that.
It's 2 hours and 17 minutes.
Oh, I was so close. I was 1 minute off.
Yeah, you were very close. I love that you brought this up, especially with the pacing, because there's a couple of things to consider in that element. I mean, one is that in the 80s, movie trilogies, right? Like we live in the era of trilogies. Like we actually grew up in the era of trilogies, and it's actually gone beyond that. Movie franchises are very comfortable doing 5, 6, 7 movies, and now we've entered the realm of Star Wars and Marvel, of course, which has no cap and will absolutely keep going back to that supply over and over again until it doesn't work. But in the 80s, that was not really the theme. I think when they saw a book that they wanted to translate to screen, it was gonna be a very expensive movie. That was, obvious right off the bat. There was a ton of content, a very rich, deep, immersive world that was very high fantasy. It was gonna take a lot for them to be able to put that out there. It was a giant gamble from the beginning, and I can't fathom any world where they were like, we're going to bank on making 3 of these, or even 2.
Yeah.
We're going to put it all into one. And I agree with you. I think that the pacing is the ultimate issue with this movie, because on top of the fact that it was super rushed, that there was so much exposition that was shoved into this with little time to sort of get to know any of the characters, to be comfortable in this crazy over-the-top universe. But even and also the runtime being 2 hours and 17 minutes.
It's too short.
This is atypical.
Yeah.
Right, of an older movie. That is a long movie to sit in a theater for back in 1984. So they kind of did everything that they could do. But on top of that, they had to fall back on weird storytelling mechanisms to try to shove even more. There's narration throughout the entire thing, not just with the narrator itself, but also with this inner monologue stuff that is like constantly going. They're whispering in the microphone about their secret thoughts, trying to give more information because we don't have enough time.
Even when people aren't inner monologuing, they're still whispering. Like 80% of the movie is whispering. It's so strange.
It's so true. And that actually calls back to the other thing that you said, which is that acting has evolved dramatically. In our lifetime, we've seen the art of acting change in a way that if you go back to the 80s, this weird, awkward overacting, right? It's an overacting that we're seeing. It's overly dramatized, overly unrealistically presented. And it doesn't feel natural in any way. And while that is a critique about this particular movie, it's also a critique about the era and that kind of movie.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think that's also one of the reasons, aside from him being an amazing actor, that Patrick Stewart is the best actor in that movie, because he comes from that kind of acting background, that, playwright, what's the word I'm looking
stage
for?
actor. He's a real stage actor. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's kind of like, that's the, I don't want to say epitome of it, but one of the top forms of that style of acting. And it's kind of where film evolves from, right? So obviously we're in a totally different space now, whereas stage acting continues to exist in its own form. But I think he was able to walk that line between being a natural human being and doing that over-the-top stage acting as well as you could in that movie.
And certainly the best among any of his peers in that movie. I would argue he probably just seemed the most natural. I think you nailed it. I think back then in the 80s and even well beyond that into the 90s and 2000s, I think that stage acting was held in high regard as sort of like the pinnacle of acting performance. You know, like we would give more credence to, more attention to somebody that came from a stage background. In fact, speaking of Patrick Stewart, I think that was one of the standouts for why he did so well in Star Trek. They used to take actors that were stage actors because the kind of delivery and monologue that was required of a captain on a Star Trek show was really akin to that style of acting. But the delivery in this particular movie, every single line is over the top, is awkward, is clumsily delivered, and it ends up breaking the immersion, which is such a delicate balance already because of the big ask for the audience to really get immersed in this extreme world, especially in the 80s.
Yeah. Suspending your disbelief is a big ask in any time, I think, but in the 80s for sure. And it's just like you said, they did all they could, but it was just too many things. It needed to be longer than 2 hours. It needed to be multiple movies, honestly.
Yeah, it did.
But 2 hours was already asking a lot. The acting style needed to change. All the whispering. There were so many times I was thinking, my first note here is that there's too much inner dialogue. And that was early on in the movie when I said that, or when I wrote that down. And I was just thinking, like, I knew going into this movie, I knew that they were going to have pacing issues. They weren't going to have enough time because I've watched the 2 new movies and I know that he's already cut a bunch of stuff out from those 2 new movies.
So a huge amount. Yeah.
A huge amount. So I was thinking, okay, they don't have the time. And immediately we're getting into all this, like every scene is full of inner dialogue. And I'm like, we don't have time for this, guys. Stop. Stop inner dialogue.
Didn't it feel like that 2 hours and 17 minutes was somehow longer than the other 2 movies combined?
Yes. I swear, obviously we're going to be doing spoilers for Dune 1 and 2 here. So if you haven't seen them, go watch them. Stop now, go watch them, then come back and finish this podcast.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Yes. Beware. We will be going into everything that we know about the first 2 remake movies, the original movie, and all of those things comprise the first book of the Dune franchise, of which, again, there are more than 20.
Yes.
But if you have any desire to not have any of this spoiled for you for the first book / both the remake movies, please do what Marco said.
Yep.
Go watch it. Come back, though.
Yep, come right back. So you go into the theater, you watch them, and then you come back and sit in your car. You listen to the podcast on the way home.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah. That's perfect. Hello, everyone in their car.
So yeah, I really knew that they were going to have all these issues. We just could not get past the inner dialogue. And I could tell, getting into it, I was like, this is going to be a slog. And you're right. It feels way longer than even just the 3, even both of them, honestly. But the 3 hours of part 2, it feels longer. And I swear, if you watch the battle scene in Dune Part 2 and the battle scene in the original 1984 movie, the battle scene, to me, it felt longer. I don't know if it actually was. I didn't time them. But I swear, it felt like it went on forever. And the final battle scene in part 2 began and over in no time, and for better or worse, I felt like it could have been longer. But this one in 1984 just, oh man, it never ended. Like we had like a whole inner monologue during the battle scene. The battle pug. We'll get into the dog later, but oh my god,
we need a whole podcast just for the pug. He was the real hero and MVP of the Dune world.
So my notes here are, because I've seen so many at this point, I was like, so many dogs with exclamation points, because I guess there had been so many dogs, including the pug, multiple times. Right after that, so you'll know at this point where we are in the movie. Right after that is when the Harkonnens or Harkonnen, depending on which pronunciation.
Tricky.
Yeah. Right after that is when the Harkonnens invade. And so we're not even halfway through the movie. And I've already written so many dogs right before that. Then the Harkonnens invade. And my very next note with more exclamation point is, he carries a dog.
Patrick Stewart shows up in battle holding the pug, man. Trying very hard to act like he's about to enter war, but he's holding this adorable little pug that's just excited to be there.
He charges into battle with this pug, and he's like, "Long live Duke Leto!" And I'm like, "Oh my god."
It's that kind of movie.
Oh,
And while we're talking about all this, I want to, obviously we're covering a lot of the story that is in the subsequent movies, so we should probably get into that as well. This is just so you guys know where the original is, and if you have any desire to skip it, we're kind of helping you to do that. There's no real need to do it, I suppose. We probably agree that the remakes have been done much better, and even the omissions that the director made, Denis Villeneuve, he is phenomenal in what he has decided to streamline when it comes to this. There's so much exposition. Some of the notes that I have for the 84 movie include that it almost assumes the audience has read the book, you know, like it's directly for the fans of the novel at the time, and they were trying, I think, to be more faithful to it. But there are some interesting departures and some that are very, very bizarre. I'm sure you noticed the weirding modules, the very odd sound guns that are going into this.
I would say it feels slightly more faithful to the book than the new movies in some ways. But anyway, I digress. I'll let you continue.
Well, no, it's true. In a lot of ways, it is. And a faithful reproduction is something that we can value, especially maybe in 84 when it was, you know, under 20 years departed from the original source material. The modern remake, I think, really felt free to re-envision the story in a way that would work better for modern audiences, that would work better for pacing and flow, believability. Again, this is an extremely high fantasy environment that we're asked to be immersed in. And in the 84 version, they made some very interesting choices. The weirding modules were a very bizarre device that was made so that the Bene Gesserit and their weirding way was basically converted into this sound weapon where they would have a microphone by their mouth, turn it on, and that extended to a handheld gun that would project words that they would say. So they would say very odd sounding words, and it would somehow be converted into force and destroy things. This was a very specific choice made by Lynch to do away with what it was replacing, which was the weirding way martial arts. He was quoted as saying that he had no interest in seeing kung fu in the desert. And at the time in the 80s, any kind of martial arts fighting sequences, choreography, that kind of thing, it was really like a kung fu movie kind of thing. That was the attachment that they had to that. That was the era of, you know, the Karate Kid and that kind of thing. And he made a very intentional decision to create an entirely bizarre technology to make it so that there wasn't much hand-to-hand fighting in Dune, which is insane because that is actually like an essential part of that story. So that was a weird choice that really took me off guard.
It was a weird choice. I was surprised by that. I guess I understand where he's coming from. I can see the kind of Karate Kid, you know, martial arts influence being something that actually probably wouldn't have fit in either one of these movies. Like, again, it shows how much filmmaking and our like ideology as a culture has evolved, you know, like how we've kind of become even more and more of a melting pot. But yeah, I mean, it was one of many strange decisions. You know, you could have said at the time, why didn't he just do sort of what they've done with the new Dune movie and instead of doing like a karate, do some, you know, more interesting, varied martial arts that aren't, you know, these people bowing and fighting hand to hand in the desert, you know?
Right, yeah. Adapted. It's a unique opportunity to try to adapt a martial arts culture to the culture of the Fremen or to the culture of the Bene Gesserit. You know, like these are expressions that modern movies do, and there's a division between certain kinds of combat that you see, and that's a good way to express a different culture.
I feel like it's really interesting how the two directors had completely different interpretations of the source material, right? And it really feels like David Lynch kind of got I don't even know if he read the first book, maybe he did, but I feel like he got this white savior fantasy from the movie, you know, or from the books. Paul is portrayed as a hero, anti-hero in the first book for sure. I mean, I think the original intention was for him to be an anti-hero, but the way it's written, he kind of comes more across as a hero. And so I can see that interpretation. If you don't read Messiah, if you don't go, you know, past, obviously we haven't, so we won't talk about it anyway, but you know, if you don't go past the first book, you can kind of come to that conclusion. So I can see how David Lynch came to these conclusions, but he just leaned into them. In the original Dune movie, Lady Jessica is a complete non-factor. She basically just cries throughout the whole movie.
I was going to say arguably worse than a non-factor because she's written in a way that she is supposed to be very tough. She even has that fight scene, which in the new one is with Stilgar, right? She grabs him and he respects her combat prowess, realizes what she is, who she is, and she's very threatening. Rebecca Ferguson, fantastic in literally everything she's ever been in. She's She's absolutely amazing.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right that while the original movie tried to convey her in words in a certain way, she was just falling apart in tears left and right. She was the worst kind of female trope, I think, of the era, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. And Johnny falls into this a bit as well. I think that's a bit truer to the book, though. I think Johnny is also kind of a very passive character in the book, from what I've heard. So maybe that one's a bit more accurate. But, the women are secondary characters, which is unfortunate, especially compared to Denis Villeneuve's interpretation, which they're very active. They play very strong roles in swaying Paul, in swaying the narrative, in showing, again, the new movies do an amazing job at showing the different dichotomies between people's perspectives and opinions and why they're leaning one way or the other.
Couldn't agree more.
And the old movie is so focused on telling you or throwing it out entirely, just saying, we don't need this, get rid of it.
Whispering it into the microphone for an inner thought. I'm having a thought that the audience should know.
Yeah. So it's Dune, the ASMR version.
Which no one signed up for.
No one signed up for.
I absolutely love what you said, and that speaks to so many things. So you brought up Messiah and the fact that, we haven't read Messiah and we haven't seen it, and that hasn't been remade yet. That would be Dune 3 if that does end up coming out.
It's going to. It better. There'll be riots in the streets if it doesn't.
Yeah, and of course it will. There's no way that it wouldn't. The critical and financial success that the two remakes have succeeded in accomplishing demand a third one.
The budget for Dune Part 2 is only $190 million, which is insane that they made such an amazing movie with that budget. It's going to absolutely make insane profits.
Because it crossed 400, I think. Yeah. I mean, it's been absolutely stellar in its performance. But in some part, I think, due to some of what you're talking about here. So the interesting thing about what you had said a moment ago in regards to Paul Atreides and his hero/anti-hero characterization, when he wrote the books, Frank Herbert ended up producing Dune and then seeing the response from those who bought and read it and understood the story. And he was actually disappointed. He was very frustrated in the way that people were receiving the character of Paul Atreides. He was seeming like a savior, like a messiah, and like a hero, and it was not his intent for him to come off that way. It was more of a cautionary tale. It was supposed to be an anti-hero kind of thing. There were multiple sides to him becoming the Lisan al-Gaib, or the Kwisatz Haderach. It didn't come across successfully. He intentionally wrote Dune Messiah to re-characterize Paul. In fact, Dune Messiah is a short book, and it can actually be viewed as an extended prologue to the story of Dune and sort of reframes his character for that reason. And I think that Denis went into it with his eyes open 100%. He knew that this character needed to come across very differently. He has on multiple occasions given a bunch of stellar interviews. If you guys out there have not listened to Denis Villeneuve talk about this process for him, it is so fascinating. But he went into it really aware of some of the problems with that story, as well as the female character's portrayal. And he went into it with the conscious decision to bring the female characters in the story of Dune to the forefront, to make them much stronger, much more influential. Chani, in addition to just having more influence, has her own arc independent of Paul, and also serves to be a much better story device to bring out more nuance in Paul's character and journey throughout the entire thing. I honestly think that these days in modern media, when we see a lot of uproar about diversity, inclusion, feminism, and all these things, it's always meaning well and sometimes comes across heavy-handed or problematic to the story, right? To the integrity of the story. I honestly believe that one of the reasons why Dune, the remake by Denis, is so successful is that he was successful in those elements. He did them in a way that it came off not just effortless, right? Not just in a way that did not detract from the main story, but in a way that actively advanced the story. I think that the overarching tale of Dune has been improved. Jessica, like you said, was terrible in the first Dune. Absolutely essential.
Yeah, plays more of a villain, honestly.
Talk about anti-hero. You don't really know where she stands, right? I mean, that makes her so much more nuanced. It's so much of a better character.
But you still, especially, and I do feel like it's possible that you could watch part 2 and still get a good experience out of it. It is an amazing movie. But without the context of part 1, like, in part 1 how much she loves Paul.
Yes.
And how much she cares about her family, and how much, survival is paramount for her, and for his survival is paramount for her. So if you just go into part 2 without seeing part 1, she just seems like she's a straight up villain. But when you have all the nuance of part 1, she really comes across as a conflicted anti-hero that I remember in the theater watching it when her baby is talking to her, and she's like, we must convert you. The baby convinces her to convert the weak. I'm like, okay, maybe we've gone a bit too far here. not the movie, but like Lady Jessica, I was like pretending like I was in the universe. I was like, okay, slow it down now. Let's not.
Yeah, you're overdoing it. You're doing too much.
Yeah.
But that sort of like interesting duality that's going on, not just in Jessica, but in the culture of the Fremen, is the other half of this coin that makes that entire process so much more rich in the new remakes versus the old movie. They are immediately accepted as exactly what they are and exactly what they should be, and there's no nuance, no doubt in the minds of the audience while we're watching the movie in 84. And there are different belief systems, different factions within the Fremen, and Jessica, represents her own faction, but in the new one, that's dual. Like, she does, as you said, care for Paul, and you know that that's true coming from the first one, but then she also has this ulterior motive, and you don't even know where that syncs up with Paul. But then the Fremen have to be convinced, and I would argue that the exposition given to us in the second Dune movie, where the Fremen are needing to be convinced, the joining and the effort put into becoming one of the Fremen, of earning his name, of Stilgar, and my God, I just complimented Rebecca Ferguson for being phenomenal, and I would argue that everyone in this entire franchise thus far has been a stellar actor. But
except one. There's one person. But yeah, we'll get to
that's true. We'll get to that. There is one, and we haven't talked about it. I'm guessing we're thinking the same one. But Stilgar, played by Javier Bardem, is, in my opinion, stole the show. Yeah. He is, bar none, the best acting in that movie, and his part is so flat in the 1984 rendition of this story, and it is the cornerstone of Dune Part 2, because he represents not just the connection and relationship and even replacement father figure that happens for Paul as he joins this new family and this new group of people, this new faction that he's becoming a part of, but he also represents one of the two sides of the Fremen trying to come to grips with their acceptance of the actual existence of the Lisan al-Gaib, and the portrayal of his character in the movie, where he brings levity to certain scenes, he brings heart to certain scenes. He is the father figure of the movie that you just fall in love with, and I can't imagine it without him. It's so hard to imagine that that's the same guy from No Country for Old Men. I mean, it's just the acting chops. I mean, Anton Chigurh, right, from No Country, that's the same guy. In case people haven't put that together, he is a phenomenal actor.
Yeah, absolutely phenomenal. It's hard to imagine without any of these characters. Denis did a masterclass of adapting a different medium to film, filmography to cinematography. And we complain all the time in all these TV shows and movies that are coming out that are adapting something like, why did you change this? Why did you that? Because they do such a bad job of adapting it. They make changes that are so unnecessary just because they want to make it their own thing. Every single change in this movie, Denis did for a reason, a good reason. It had a purpose to make this more palatable, to make this more of a enthralling narrative, to make the audience feel like they're a part of this world. And those are the kind of changes that, I want to see in every adaptation where it's necessary. And it's just great to see that this kind of artistry exists, because I was thinking it was dead.
Yes.
Right. I was thinking that we'll never have good adaptations ever.
No, I was thinking the same thing. And not even these days, almost everything that comes out is a reimagining of something else. And then you always run the risk of, you're trying to make the gamble between attaining a new audience and then not losing the previous audience. And I have not found a single fan of the original Dune who is upset about the changes that were made in these new movies. I don't think that I've come across one. It's actually insane. I've been scouring the internet, looking at reviews, people's thoughts. I just wanted to get an idea of where people stand on this, because it was such an extremely positive experience for me. I was just kind of looking for a counterpoint. And I've really only come across a couple of criticisms in this world. But like you said, every single change that they made was not a stylistic choice to put your own stamp on something that was already fine, which we see all the time. I'm going to throw Wheel of Time under the bus here. Any Wheel of Time fans can groan along with me.
So many. Halo, Witcher.
Oh, yeah.
Witcher, the worst one.
Witcher. That's bad.
That hurts me so bad even to say it.
I know, it does me too. There was a lot that was omitted, a lot that was changed, and he has advanced the story of Dune to a place that it has never been before, and now people are clamoring for more. So you can't fault any of that.
And one thing I want to touch on real quick before we move on to maybe talking about some of the characters. When we're talking about the dichotomy with, Lady Jessica and how her role has changed and how she's a lot more of an active character and, compared to the 84 movie, the same thing I feel like is the case with the Fremen. The Fremen are basically basically, like I said, they just accept him. Oh, he's our savior, blah, blah, blah. But they also don't teach him anything.
He teaches
does
them.
all the teaching.
He teaches them. Exactly that. Yes.
And I was like, okay. I know he does teach them some stuff. And Jessica, the whole point of her becoming the Reverend Mother is to teach them the weirding way.
And to guide them in the prophecy.
And to guide them.
Yeah.
Yep. So I get that there is some teaching that needs to happen here. But he needs to learn from them too, right?
Right, which is almost the entire focus of the movie. I mean, he goes through, that's the whole arc. He is desperately trying, and he is committed to it from the very beginning. He knows his path. He wants to be a part of this, and he has to earn it. And there's even characters that were very small. I apologize, I forget the name. It was Chani's friend who was sort of opposing Paul, right? Like in the 84 rendition of the movie, it's a guy and he has like one line and no part. And Denis wrote in this female character, made it a female character that was like opinionated, had the opposite perspective. He had to sort of win her over. She sort of represented, I think, the reticence of the Fremen to accept Paul, and he had to learn step by step what it means to be a Fremen. And not only did he end up really valuing that journey and the acceptance that he inevitably attained, but we valued it too. Like that was such an important aspect of the growth of his character and him becoming what he needs to become. And that was the lion's share of the second movie. It was a lot of time and effort put into that.
Yeah, a lot of time and effort, and it was incredibly well done. I guess we can dive into some of the characters. I want to talk about Princess Irulan, if I'm saying that right, because Denis did the same thing he did in the first movie, which was basically tease a female lead that will be in the next movie with her being in it, small little bits here and there, small little dialogue segments, nothing major, and just make you want more.
Right, because she was also awesome.
Yes, because she was awesome. Yes.
She was. She portrayed that character really well, and I think like the only part that she had in the 84 version of the movie was that she actually was the one that did the introduction, sort of opening monologue that sets the ground for the universe and the dynamics within, was Princess Irulan in the original and was replaced by Chani in the remake. She actually did the introduction sort of from the perspective of a Fremen and her feelings about Arrakis. And I think that it was much better done in that way, but you're right. We were left wanting more with her, but she will play a very significant part in Messiah.
No, I think it's brilliant the way he does it, because, sometimes when you finish a movie, you just want more of that world, more of that universe. And I feel that way with Dune, but I also want more of specific characters, which is rare in a movie, Like, I think most of the times with movies, if I want more, it's because I want more of that world, that universe, the story in general. But with Dune, twice now, he did it with Chani, and now he's done it with the princess. I want more of specific characters. That to me is like an exceptional feat in storytelling, to make me want more of the overall story, the overall world building, but also individual characters and characters that are no longer with us.
Oh, and we've lost so many already. Fade Routha.
Austin Butler is amazing.
Oh my God.
He is.
Are we on him now? Because
so
I need
good.
to scream about how amazing this guy was. I mean, we've seen him. I mean, he crushed it as Elvis. I'm not sure if you saw the biopic there, but
I have not.
He really got a lot of attention there, and he has now proven it is his acting skill. He literally he is one of the greatest up and coming stars, I think, of this new generation. And it's amazing to see, because if you've only seen Fade Routha in this movie, if you've only seen Austin Butler here, he is nothing like that. He is the sweetest, calmest, most soft-spoken guy. I've been watching interviews with him. It blows my mind that that's the same dude. He is incredible.
He's a super thoughtful person too. I was watching an interview and this guy asked some good questions, but he was just asking questions and he had thoughtful answers for all of them. And then at the end, he was like, dude, that was a really good interview. He was like, you asked some amazing questions that nobody else has thought of. And I was just like, you didn't need to say that. Like, you didn't need to go out of your way. But you honestly, you honestly had some like real nice feedback for that guy. And just, you could have just got up and just left.
And in such stark contrast to what we see a lot. I mean, those guys that have to do those interview things, I mean, like, it's a tough situation. These people doing press junkets, they have to do 500 a day. There's so many. They're answering the same questions over and over and over again.
Same ones over and over and over.
But so often it's an unpleasant thing. You can see actors get snappy. It's their job. They're doing their best. They have to ask those same questions.
I would get annoyed if I had to answer the same questions over.
Yeah, exactly. But it really shows, I think, the quality of character that Austin Butler has in real life. But I was excited for this from the beginning. So, you know, when the first movie wrapped and we were looking forward to the next movie, there was an interview with Dave Bautista, who plays Raban. And he was singing Austin Butler's praises real early, saying, guys, Austin Butler is amazing and he is terrifying in this upcoming movie. Like I had heard that ahead of time, and then the next thing that I saw of Fade Rauta was in Call of Duty.
Oh yeah.
When
that's right.
his character skin appeared in Call of Duty, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is what this guy looks like? I have no concept for how this is going to go. And of course, if you've seen the 84 movie, the reimagining of the Harkonnens and how much they're different, you know, they decided to go with a hairless look, right? Everyone from that planet has no hair. There's no, you know, Stellan Skarsgård also phenomenal as Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Just amazing, especially in contrast with the previous iteration of the character. I think it was so masterfully reinterpreted in that way. But then they took that same motif of no hair and they got this real handsome guy and they put him in this look that was so extreme. And he was played by Sting in the original. And that was actually Sting that played that Fade Rauta.
The original was a very Mick Jagger, David Bowie-esque kind
He
of.
reminded me, and there's so many parallels between Blade Runner and Dune. There's so many odd parallels, you'd be shocked. And in fact, Denis also directed Blade Runner 2049.
Blade Runner remake. Yeah. I think he learned a lot from that with this remake, you know, like he brought a lot of his remake chops from experiencing that remake over into this
I
one.
agree completely. And he would agree with you as well. I think that he had said something to the effect of that movie still kind of haunts him. I actually think it was a phenomenal movie. I loved Blade Runner 2049. Not everyone feels that way. It's not a Dune where everyone universally agrees, but it is a similar telling and it's a similar level of immersion, which is the absolute biggest compliment that I can give to any movie ever, especially science fiction movies. And it gets harder and harder to accomplish the more extreme and high fantasy these worlds are. And there's almost nothing higher and more extreme fantasy than the settings of Dune and Blade Runner. And these things are really difficult to commit to in a convincing enough way that you enter this very bizarre, incredibly alien landscape and you're not pulled out of it going, oh, this is a weird movie, you know, like, and that is the biggest compliment that I can give a movie like that is when the actors and the cinematography and the pacing and the storytelling leaves you so immersed in the world that nothing pulls you out of it the entire time, regardless of how extreme it is. But Sting as Fade Rauta reminds me of Roy Batty, the replicant from Blade Runner. He had the same manic energy. It was that very bizarre character portrayal that, you know, it's Sting and he was Sting and his acting wasn't worse than anyone else's in the scenes that he was in. They were all atrocious, but it was a real reimagining.
I thought he kind of brought a different flair to the movie. I thought he was interesting.
Sting?
Like there were so many other characters. Yeah, Sting. I was so many of the characters I would have replaced before him. Like,
yeah,
or so many other actors, I should say. But yeah, no, I agree with everything you're saying. And real quick on Austin Butler, he is my favorite kind of actor. So you talked about how Javier Bardem is your favorite character and actor in this movie. He's my second favorite. Austin Butler and Fade is my favorite.
I don't blame you.
And Austin Butler is my favorite kind of actor in general. He's a method actor, and I love method actors, dude. They just knock it out of the park. I'm thinking like, what's his name who played the Joker? I'm so bad with actor names. You guys have to forgive me.
Heath Ledger.
Yeah. Heath Ledger. I'm forgetting other actors' names, but I could go down the list if I actually had a list
Jim
in front of
Carrey
me.
in Man on the Moon is an excellent example of that.
Jim Carrey.
Probably the most infamous version of that, actually.
But yeah, I love method actors. I think that if I was going to be an actor, that's what I would do.
It makes it better on the audience and harder on the people working with them.
Yeah, unfortunately. It was funny. I was listening to an interview with this cast who was talking about him method acting, and they said that he took a step back in this movie. They said he normally, he goes like 80-20 or something into a character and his personality. And they said he brought it back to more like 50-50, 40-60. So he wasn't method acting all the time when he was around them. He was like, more himself more of the time. So they said they were happy about that.
I'm not sure you'd want to hang out with Fade Rauta between takes.
Fade,
you know what I mean? At the lunch cart, he's
just like threatening to kill you all the time.
But I mean, that's part of the mastery of that character's portrayal is he was so manic. He was so evil, but in this almost calm way. I think he brought such nuance to the psychosis of that character that I don't think that everyone would have been able to portray. Like, we were terrified of him, we hated him, but we sort of liked and admired the character the whole time as being masterfully portrayed.
Yes.
I think that's a delicate balance to strike, isn't it?
It is. It's an extremely delicate balance, and him and the writing team, and obviously Denis directing it, did an amazing job striking that balance. And obviously, one last thing about him, but his changing his voice to match.
Oh, yeah.
Baron Harkonnen.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Insane.
He made it so that they were related, and you believed it.
Yes.
You absolutely believed it. In fact, everyone on set was shocked. They turned around and they're like, how did you do that? Like, put on the mannerisms or at least the cadence of Stellan Skarsgård, who has a very unique way of speaking.
Yes.
I mean, that's one of his calling cards. And on a lot of the compliments that I just gave Austin Butler for his portrayal of Fade Rauta, I would also like to give to Stellan Skarsgård, because he's
amazing.
Portrayed Baron Harkonnen in such a way that also applies. He was cold, calculating, evil, but you somehow admired that character and its portrayal throughout the entire thing, and such a departure from the previous iteration. And again, I can't say what he was portrayed like in the book, but if it's not the way that Stellan did it, I'll be disappointed, because it was so perfect. I wouldn't have changed a thing.
Yeah, you could really see, because the Harkonnens were a minor family before they got Arrakis, and you can really see the political maneuvering. Like, you can see the Baron being the kind of person to have the political chops and the cunning and the backstabbing to make the political maneuvering necessary to get in the Emperor's good graces, to get the Emperor to, use the Harkonnens. Obviously, he's using them, but, that's how you move up in this world, in this Dune world. To put him in his house in a position to become a major house, to take over Arrakis. And you admire that in a certain, in a weird way, but you're like, I admire what they've done with this character. I can see how this character is so well portrayed. I can see how he was able to get his house to where they are now.
It was so believable. Yeah, absolutely. 100% from the very beginning. And that's actually one of the elements that I think ended up serving the story so much better in the remake. And this is a change that we didn't talk about. But in the 1984 version, there was a lot of exposition that took place off of Arrakis. And in addition to that, like the first half of the movie, and in addition to all of the background we were seeing with the Navigators Guild, like all of this extra stuff, and who was pressuring the Emperor to do it. In addition to all those things that we didn't see in both remake movies, we also found out of the plot for the Harkonnens to leave and then come back and destroy Atreides. That's the first scene we see, effectively, in the 1984 version. We kind of followed and tracked the perspective of Paul and Lady Jessica in the remakes in a way that we find out when they find out. And I actually think that served the story much more. We knew to not trust the Harkonnens. We knew that they were evil, but we got to feel the unease of the tenuous situation that Atreides was in, not knowing what was coming and feeling that danger.
Yeah, and the new movies do such a good job of making it feel like Paul, his father, their house, they don't have a choice. They have to go to Arrakis. There is no choice here. Whereas in the old movie, in the original the 84 movie, I was just like, why are they going to Arrakis? Like, it
was almost like a play for power, right? Like they were also making a play for power, and it was different. It was based on honor in the remakes. It was a totally different perspective on that move.
Yep. And it was incredibly well done. It made it so believable because honor is what their house is about. It fits them and their personalities. And, it talked about the Bene Gesserit, the Reverend Mother, the main lady, the lady that raised Jessica. I can't remember her name.
Mohaim.
Okay. Is her name ever even said at all?
It is infrequently. Yes, Reverend Mother Mohaim is Mohiam. Mohiam? Mohaim, I think.
We'll go with Mohaim. She even says, like they have that defiance in their eyes. And you can see that when they're like, okay, this is a trap. We know this is a trap, but we are going to make this work.
Right.
Like
we must.
We don't have a choice, but we must make this work. And I am going to defy whatever the outcome that is planned for me is, I'm going to defy destiny. Right. And that it just fits perfectly and I absolutely love it. It's one of the best changes, or, there's so many good changes in the new Dune, but I think that's definitely one of the better one that sets up the whole world. It makes the whole thing believable. I mean, I liked the Spacers Guild has a play. That was one of the few things I liked with the 84 movie. I did like the Spacers Guild. I thought it was nice to see who was pressing the Emperor's hand, but I felt like they had way too much power in the 84 one. It was like
not explained.
It was like
and why they had that power.
And not explained.
That dynamic just was not explored.
Yeah, they were just telling the Emperor what to do. And I love in the new Dune movies, there are so many different power dynamics, but people are playing this political. It was almost like early Game of Thrones, where people playing this political game, right? Where they all have different levers of power that they can pull and push to make people people do, the things they want, lean the ways they want, but it's one person can't pull one lever and control everything. They're pushing and pulling back and forth, and there's this power balance dynamic that they're all playing to try to become the one person with all the power. Because even the Emperor, who has probably the most power, doesn't have one lever that he can pull that does everything that he wants, right?
It's way nuanced, because in addition to the guild that is pressuring him, the Bene Gesserit who is working with him, of course, in both movies, is also its own faction with its own goals that, is manipulating everything. And we just don't know where all those things line up. And I think it's better when we don't.
Yes, I agree. But speaking of things that we liked and didn't like, and talking about characters, do we want to say his name at the same time?
Yeah, okay. 3, 2, 1. Christopher Walken.
So bad.
It was okay. Wait. I want to put it in perspective. Remember when I said that the highest compliment that I can give a movie, especially a fantasy movie, is to allow the escapism that I'm looking for when I go and see a movie like this and not break immersion? This was the only real tangible issue for me that had a simple solution. And the problem is it's not
casting Christopher Walken.
It's not casting Christopher Walken. It's not even his fault. He acted fine. The acting was fine, but it was Christopher Walken. Christopher Walken is in Dune. Why? He's one of those people that is himself in everything that they ever do. And this is the prime example of one of those opportunities where you realize that sometimes picking someone that does not have a recognizable face is way better than picking someone that you immediately attribute to a million things. I just expected him to start dancing like that music video from the early 2000s. It's so goofy.
He felt like he had so again, one of the things I actually liked in the original Dune, despite the fact that the Emperor seemed like he was under complete control of the Spacers Guild, outside of those Spacer Guild scenes in the 84 movie, the Emperor felt like he had real power and weight behind his words. People listened to him, did what he said. In the new one, it feels like Walken has no authority at all. I mean, he does, but he just seems like a frail man. His tone of voice is so quiet and, reserved. Felt like a man on his last legs and not an emperor in charge. To me, the contrast is Baron Harkonnen and the Emperor. When the Emperor talks to the princess and he's like, you would make a fierce empress, because he's expecting her to take over for him at some point, but maybe he's not quite ready for that moment. Baron Harkonnen has the same moment, where he's like, I'll make you emperor, whatever, Fade's like, I'll drown you in that tub. And he's like, oh, let's not be too hasty with that.
Yeah, wait, I want you to take over Arrakis.
Yeah. But he's like, at some point you probably are going to drown me. At some point you are going to take over all this. But he's like, not yet, kid. Let's not rush that. I still have plans. And with the Emperor, it's just like, yeah, at some point, princess, you'll do all this. And I'm just like, where's your power here, man? Like, you're the most powerful person. If there's a singular person who has the most power in the entire show, which it's tough to say that because everybody has power in different forms throughout this whole show. It's very well balanced, or movie, excuse me. It's very well balanced. Theoretically, the Emperor should be the one with the most. I mean, that's the way it seems to be portrayed. That's the way it's explained when we're getting dialogue, with the rare moments where we're getting dialogue exposition to us, because this movie does a really good job of showing and not telling. But still, that's the way it's portrayed. And then when he actually acts it out, it's just like he's just Christopher Walken.
He is Christopher Walken. A counterpoint to that is that this element that you just brought up is sort of intrinsically attached to another of the elements that you and I both agreed that we liked, which is that the dynamic being shifted in that way, with him being older, him being weaker, him being maybe more of a puppet in other ways and not having the authority that maybe you feel like he should have had. That is directly what led to a little bit more room for some of the female characters to have their part, because Princess Irulan, which did not have that authority or that part at all, actually ended up having a great deal of autonomy, or at least in potential autonomy, in the sequel as a direct result of that. He was weak, and so she was orchestrating things a little bit more. She had much more interaction with the Reverend Mother. The Reverend Mother was pulling the strings. It was very clear that she had manipulated the Emperor into doing the deed of having Harkonnen leave and then trap Atreides on Arrakis. Like, it was sort of her dealings in the background. So his weakness wasn't, at least for me, weakness in a vacuum. It was actually a sort of plot device that allowed some room for some other characters to build up some more influence in the story that I actually ended up enjoying. I think that Christopher Walken being Christopher Walken was a detraction, but not for me necessarily that it was that he didn't have all of the authority.
I agree in part. I think I would have left his portrayal, especially now that we've had this dialogue about it, I would have left his portrayal the way it was, with one exception. When he got the message from Paul saying that, he's alive, he's on Arrakis, come fight me, basically.
Yep.
That's when I would have loved to have seen him switch. Like, I would have loved to, instead of dropping it and walking away despondent like everything's lost, I would have loved to have seen him like grip it tightly and be mad, and be like, okay, I'm one last time, I'm gonna be the emperor. And instead he was just like, let's go die.
Instead he said, I'm Christopher Walken. If I had a good Christopher Walken impression, that would have been perfect, but I don't. But it was a very odd choice.
Yeah, but speaking of the princess, though, she is so, I mean, we talked about her earlier. I don't want to go back over too much, but the one scene that I think was amazing was her relationship with the Reverend Mother. Like, it was so well portrayed, and I love that her and the Reverend Mother are both, I mean, obviously they're both Bene Gesserit. They're both, basically on the same side. They're as aligned as any two characters in Dune could have been aligned, honestly, because honestly, even Lady Jessica and Paul seem more opposed at times.
Yeah.
So those two seemed very aligned, but it was funny to even see even in the Bene Gesserit, even with those two, there was a little bit of that power dynamic. So much nuance in this when she teases the Reverend Mother to come out and admit that Paul is still alive, because she poses as a question. She's like, what if Paul Atreides is still alive? Right. And, she gets, instead of like accusing the Reverend Mother, she's like, oh, I just figured it out. What if Paul, even though she probably had figured it out forever ago, she's like, oh, I figured it out. And she makes the Reverend Mother admit like, oh, yeah, no. He is still alive, but you can't tell anyone, because if you do, we're all dead.
Right. And actually, like you said, I loved the nuance of that dynamic, because it seems for a moment like she's also just being manipulated, that Princess Irulan was not clued in on everything, that maybe she'll have her own perspective on this, or maybe she'll have her own reaction to this information, but then she does end up giving deference to the Reverend Mother. There's such an interesting dynamic between those two characters. It would be sad if it was less than what it ended up being.
Yeah, and I think it'll get expanded on. I mean, Denise said it in interviews that he's going to treat her just like he did Zendaya, Chani, that, in the first movie, she was a minor character, and in the second movie, he told her she'd be a major character, and he said the same thing to Florence, that she's going to be a minor character in this movie, and in Messiah, she'll be a major character.
And I believe it, because it was so expertly done in Chani's case in the second movie. I'm really looking forward to seeing the third one. On that note, the third one is a little tricky. There's a lot of reasons why Messiah is not confirmed officially at this moment. So if everyone out there is waiting for Dune 3 with bated breath, like the rest of us, like Marcos and I are for sure, the unfortunate truth is that while we probably will get it, and Denis has been working on the screenplay, which supposedly is almost finished, we will have to wait. There's only a couple of years between Dune Part 1 and Dune Part 2, but in Dune Messiah, the third installment, there's a few things that are going to make that drag its feet. So one is that this is a harrowing movie to make. These are literally filmed in like the deserts of Jordan. It is a huge deal. It is in the middle of the most inhospitable area that you could possibly film in. Even Butler had said that in his scenes when he was on his planet doing that duel with the Atreides guy, even there, it was 110 degrees on set when they were working. It is exhausting. They did two relatively quickly back to back, and it was a troublesome experience. The second thing is he has a couple of extra projects that he needs to work on. Denise says that one of them, he can't say what it is, but it has a lot of time sensitivity to it, so he has to get that out quickly. There's also going to be Cleopatra. It's a movie that he is working on right now, which will also come out first. And then he will be probably returning for Dune Messiah, but with an intentional wait for the reasons I mentioned a moment ago, as well as hoping that Timothée Chalamet ages a bit. Yeah. The difference between Dune and Dune Messiah is 12 years. That's how much time has passed in the story. He's hoping that he will age a bit, get a little bit more rugged, probably. Timothée Chalamet is incredible. I think he actually more faithfully represents the character of Paul Atreides. He's more of a kid. He's a little bit more innocent.
His acting levels up dramatically in this movie. I mean, I loved him in the first movie. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I thought he was fantastic, but he just like comes into his own in this movie.
And yet,
sure.
even though the acting might be slightly different or more advanced, it doesn't make a jarring departure from the previous character. It's almost like the character is just growing up, which is exactly what we want to see. And he's been living among the Fremen. He has a very different life experience that he did before. He's becoming the Messiah reluctantly. He's the reluctant Messiah character that we know he has to become. And it's taking a toll on him. And he's becoming a more adept actor as time goes by. I mean, I think that he's a real standout for this. Since we're talking characters, though, how do you feel about Johnny? Do you like Zendaya's performance in the film?
Yeah, and I'm not a Zendaya fan. There's nothing like, there's not a single performance at first that I'm like, that was bad. Like, I think she's a good actor in general, but I'm not like, I can't think of another performance at first where I'm like, that was good, right? Like the main thing that pops out in my mind is Spider-Man, right?
Yeah.
That's her, I think she's most famous for. I can't think of a single moment in any of the Spider-Mans where I'm like, she's a good actor. I'm just like, that's fine. Like, she's average, right?
Yeah.
She's fine. But she is really good in this. I think she portrays the alternate perspective that honestly Denis kind of made up because it's not really in the books. You know, she portrays the alternate perspective very well, gives us that dichotomy that we're looking for between Jessica and Chani that Paul is struggling with in his head. Does that really well. And her facial expression.
I was just going to say,
she has
such expressive eyes. She has so much facial expression in her silent moments. She conveys a great deal.
My favorite one, I mean, she does so many, obviously with the final fight with Paul and Fade and, the whole marriage proposal. And those are all fantastic. But my favorite one is actually the worm riding scene. When he succeeds in riding the worm, she makes this face of joy and relief that is, I mean, it touched my heart. It's so human.
That scene was incredible.
I cannot think of a moment in a movie. I'm sure if I went back and watched other movies, I'd change my mind. But at least in the moment, I can't think of another movie where in a single moment, just in an instant, not through a whole scene, but just in one moment, an actor had a more human expression. Mm-hmm. And I was blown away by that. I was like, that is amazing. And obviously the whole scene was amazing, but that one moment, that nanosecond was fantastic. It must have been like a miracle take because I can't believe that her, let alone any actor, was able to have that like just natural reaction.
To convey so much without saying a word. I mean, that's the real acting, right? So you got to give her credit for that. I think that the character, the role, the device that she ends up serving as, and the acting for that character are really good. The reason why I asked is that one of the few, admittedly very few, criticisms I've seen lobbied against the movie was that in this really extreme environment of an alien world with all of these alien factions, the Fremen being this really tangible culture, I really feel like you get a real physical grip on what these people are like. They're conveyed well, the language, the movement, the clothing, the sieges, their spirituality. It's just so much more at the forefront of this movie than it was in the 1984 version. And Zendaya, while acting well, comes across as maybe not so Fremen and just kind of vaguely Californian.
Yeah, she's California.
And that was
no. She's North Fremen, man. She's North Arakan.
I know, but her best friend is North Arakan, and she is much more immersed in that culture than Zendaya.
But her best friend is kind of like, her best friend is kind of like middle Arakan, all right?
I thought she portrayed that character so well. Go back and watch her scenes. She was so authentic, I think, in that. She was
phenomenal. Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm joking a bit. She definitely comes across as not part of the culture as much.
Even though the acting is great. The acting is good. It's just she's not quite the culture. And did you know that I actually looked it up afterwards? I laughed out loud when I read that, and literally out loud, and I Googled it. She's from Oakland, California. She was born and raised where I'm from.
Yeah, she definitely is. It definitely comes across, but I guess you can't take the California
out of the Fremen. You can take the Fremen out of California.
Maybe they should have just had all of the northern Fremen be from SoCal, right?
Hey, excuse me, that's NorCal, buddy?
Oh, NorCal. I'm sorry. I don't know your California regions.
The weird thing is it is dead center California, but everything north of like LA is considered Northern California.
Okay, so I just need to watch more of the Californians on SNL.
Oh my God, have you seen those? Dude,
yeah, I love
being
those.
From California, when I literally have watched and rewatched those, dying laughing. They are so funny and accurate. The way that we talk about directions to places, it's every bit that. It's perfect.
I die laughing every time I watch those. Those are some of the few, I like SNL most of the time, but those are some of the few ones that I go back and I always
rewatch to laugh at. Yeah,
yes,
completely.
And rewatch. Yes. But since we're on things that are, maybe things we don't like as much, obviously good movie. I think it's definitely up there with some of the better movies ever made. I don't think it's the best, but Dune 1 and 2 are definitely, especially if you put them together as one movie, definitely one of the best best ever.
Which is fair to do, because I would do it with Lord of the Rings. To me, that's one movie,
yeah,
man.
Yeah, I think it's fair. But since we're talking on things that we potentially don't like as much, what are your thoughts about Fade's fight with the Atreides? That was one of the, the cinematography was exceptional.
Yeah.
Probably some of the best ever. On his homeworld, that black sun is amazing. 10 out of 10 visuals.
Incredible.
But the setup for that fight was really weird.
It was a little weird.
I don't like the fact that they drugged the combatants first. I'm like, okay, I don't like that. He's supposed to be this badass warrior, but yeah, sure, they don't want him to die, so they drug him. But then obviously they don't drug one of them because the Baron's playing some political games, which is awesome. Love that touch. But then they basically fight him one at a time, which is the standard movie trope of, we have this guy surrounded, let's just all fight him one at a time.
No, we'll take turns.
Yeah. And then when he finally has the final confrontation in that fight with the non-drugged Atreides, the guards that are guarding the entrances to the arena all surround the guy and actually help. I know he tells them not
Yeah, he
to.
gets mad.
But I didn't need Austin Butler to do anything more to make me believe that he really wanted this fight. I could tell that he was excited to fight someone that was going to give him a real fight. His acting was so good that I could tell that. I don't need you to put in any other mechanism to show me that or tell me that. And they did that, and all it did was detract from this guy. Now he's gotten some assistance. It's not like the guard missed. He actually hit him and stabbed him with some kind of needle. Who knows what was in that needle?
Well, and Fade got mad.
Yeah,
he actually acknowledged that as like a frustrating thing.
Yeah, because he wanted a fair fight. I mean, it seems like you see him with in the final fight with Paul, he was happy that it was a fair fight. He gets to fight Paul one-on-one. Paul gave him an honorable fight, didn't use the voice, none of that. And when he died, he gave him a compliment. He was like, a good fight, Atreides.
Yeah. God, I love that scene.
Yeah, that scene's awesome. But like, they do enough in the movie to show the kind of character Fade has. I want them to do more to show what a badass fighter is, so that when he fights Paul, not for a moment, even when Paul got stabbed, did I think Paul was in any kind of trouble. I just didn't, because they hadn't built Fade up to be this unstoppable force. It just seemed like he was a good fighter, and they hadn't built him up to be the greatest, He needs to be the greatest to fight the god, basically.
Right, but that is an interesting thing, because that definitely was like a choice and not like a unknown misstep. I think the dynamic that was going into that was that even though we want to build him up as like this super badass fighter, he is a Harkonnen, which means that it's more like slimy cheating to do whatever he can get to win. And I actually enjoyed part of that. I agree with you, and I hadn't thought of that until you mentioned it, that oftentimes when you take a villain like this and you're building them up to be the final boss, right? And that's going to be the big hurdle at the end where they have the big duel. Like you have to find a way to establish them as a very intimidating character ahead of time. And that's true. I guess in that way they did not accomplish that. But I do know that what they were trying to accomplish in the scene on the homeworld when he was fighting somebody was pretty nuanced, because he was given this birthday present. It was really just for show. And they all knew it, including Fade, who knew it. It was were going to be drugged. When he discovered that he wasn't drugged, when the Atreides member was not drugged, he was conflicted. You could tell, like, okay, I'm doing this and I can't wait to kill this guy. But he was also annoyed. I would say that's probably the best word for it. Annoyed at his uncle, glared at him. They have a moment looking at each other from very far away. He's upset about it, but then he's like, okay, I'm going to do this. I've been put in this position. I have to do this. And then to have guards come would weaken him in that perspective. So he got mad at that. And then the follow-up was that very important scene that you had mentioned earlier when Baron Harkonnen was in the tub and he threatened to drown him. It gave room for, if not his badass fighting prowess, at least his ruthlessness and his willingness to do whatever it takes to win, and even to threaten to kill his own uncle, who is still the Baron of House Harkonnen. There was a lot of elements that came out of that I think aided the personal character of the character, if not just to build him up as a super badass fighter.
I agree. I think there's a middle ground there, though. Like, to me, it also weakened the Baron. Like, the Baron set this up where if he's going to succeed and prove that he was strong and capable and was going to be the one to inherit Arrakis, or he was going to fail and die, is what, at least the way that it seemed like the Baron was planning it out. And to not have the guards come and potentially assist him makes the Baron look weaker. How does the Baron not have control over these guards? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah, I got the the feeling that they were acting on their own will, and if they would have been successful in helping too much, that Fade would have killed them or the Baron would have killed them as well. I mean, it was obviously an intentional move on the Baron's part. But since we're on this particular scene, had you heard, I mean, so this was one of the coolest things that I came across randomly. In the 1984 version, the Baron is like strangely, incestuously attracted to Fade, right?
Yeah.
There's like this weird lust that he has for his nephew, which I don't know if that's true to the book. I'm not sure, but they decided to do away with that in like, there's some sort of fondness, obviously, that the Baron has for Fade, but it isn't portrayed in that way. They decided to do away with that. But that scene where Fade kisses the Baron, right? Butler kisses Stellan Skarsgård. And that was entirely ad-libbed. Do you know that? He just did that on the spot. Butler decided to do that, and Skarsgård, to his credit, rolled with it perfectly, and everyone was enamored with that scene. It may not have been that same incestuous element, but it complicated that relationship in such a delicate way that I thought added to the sort of like unpredictable, reckless abandon of the character of Fade. You know, like he was threatening to kill him in one moment, even though he had all the power, and then he kisses him in the next moment. He is so volatile. And I think that's the best word for how successful Butler was in conveying the character of Fade. He was volatile. He just seemed unpredictable and dangerous with his own character, persona, and acting separate from any individual combat prowess or deed that he had portrayed. It was masterful.
Oh, absolutely. It was definitely masterful. I agree completely. And I think the 84 movie was portraying the book correctly. Obviously, I haven't read the books, but from what I've heard, I think that was kind of a thing in the book. Don't quote me, audience.
You're getting quoted right now.
Yeah, I mean, I loved that scene in the new movies where he kisses him, because I was just like, it just sealed his character's, like you said, the persona of this character, this chaotic force, where one moment he's threatening to kill this man, the next moment he loves him in a, familiar, it seemed like a familial way to me, where he was just like, this guy just promised to make me emperor. Like, I love him now.
Yeah. I mean, he's going to take advantage of whatever goes on, but he's just dangerous all the time. Like, even though he's on the side of the Harkonnen, he's capable of anything. And he says it himself. When he finds out in the final fight with Paul, he finds out that he's related to him. And in that moment, he says, I've killed family members before. And they don't have to go into that at all. I believe him completely. You know what I mean? Like, oh yeah, it's absolutely. Just so well conveyed.
I mean, he threatened to kill Raban. So.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
Which is another thing that I'm a little disappointed with. I understand that a part of Raban's character is this like cowardice when he's at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
But I felt like they kind of rushed that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Like I wanted to see, like, give me a few more minutes. Like, instead of the moment that Muad'Dib shows up, he runs away, have him fight him for a little bit and then be like, oh yeah, I can't beat this guy. And then, run away as a coward. And then when he fights Gurney at the end, like, have that fight last a little bit. You can make it so that Gurney is never in any moment in any danger. It is clear Gurney is the superior fighter. I would be totally fine with that. But just make it last a bit longer. Make it seem like this is an actual fight and that this guy isn't just chickening out and running with his tail between his legs at every possible moment.
And for the exact reason that you just gave about Fade, because unlike Fade, we got to see enough exposition for Raban that he has been built up as a threat. It seemed like he was given that platform to get to the point where we hate him, we're intimidated by him. He is like a scary force to be reckoned with that will have to inevitably be reckoned with by someone by the end, right? He's the mini boss. He's the mini boss that we're supposed to fight along the way. Like, this is a storytelling trope. And that was a very unceremonious end that he met quite abruptly.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think it's one of the few small mistakes that the movie makes. Real quick, since I mentioned Patrick Stewart, wouldn't Patrick Stewart have been a good emperor in this movie?
I think there was even some call for that, and I could have seen it. Especially because of the way that they decided to portray him in this one, in juxtaposition to the first one. Because modern day Patrick Stewart would have played that role in that same way. It would have come across in the same way. We've seen Patrick Stewart very recently in the Picard series, and some of the criticism that I would lobby against that. And again, this is absolutely no slight to Sir Patrick Stewart, one of the greatest actors of my generation. I adore him, but he has lost a step. He is an older guy. He has less conviction, less strong line delivery, which is sort of his iconic calling card, right? This sort of strong line delivery. It would have come across in that same way in that his character was waning, right? Sort of weakening and about to be on his way out. I think that actually would have been a really cool throwback to the original because people like to see that. It would have been cool to see him reprise a role.
Yeah, I think so too. It would have been a nice callback. But anyway, Raban's unceremonious exit was one of the few missteps I think the movie made. But I think the only other misstep that, we talked about Christopher Walken, we talked about the fight in the arena, Raban. And the other thing I didn't like was this movie does such a great job of showing you without telling you. It does a great job of world building, of keeping its exposition well structured and, in the flow of the movie. And we got none of that for when the Freemen were wiped out. The
Freemen.
Sorry, I was watching a podcast about Dune, and where they go on during a review, and one of the people on the podcast kept calling them the Freemen, and it's stuck in my head. I can't stop. It's Fremen, guys. It's Fremen. But where the Fremen get wiped out in the north, or most of the, a lot of them, they just make it seem like, let's use artillery, and everybody's like, you're a genius, use artillery. It's like, wait, how did you know where they were? If you knew where they were the whole time, why didn't you do this before? And why is everybody acting like artillery is this genius move? You've been using it throughout the whole movie.
Well, and the real twist, I guess, in the fate of the Fremen was finding the atomics,
yes,
which also was an interesting element. It felt like it kind of came out of nowhere in the Dune Part 2 remake until I saw the 1984 version, and it was just a given. It was so out of nowhere. There was they didn't even find them. There wasn't even any story arc about the development of that ability. It was so random, and yet ended up serving such an integral role in how they were able to defeat the Emperor.
And Stilgar saved that scene in Part 2, in the new one, because he's like, this is the dumbest thing ever. How have you?
One of the moments of levity, the wonderful moments of levity that he gives. It's like, this is the most obvious place. This is so stupid.
Yeah, and he just keeps saying over and over, this is dumb.
And then they go, but that's the genius of it. It was right out in the open. No one knew to look for it. He goes, it's stupid though. Yeah, exactly.
He just he will not let it go. He's like, this is dumb. I do not care.
It's so funny.
And I love the part where he was like, they were like, did you find it? And he was like, I wasn't looking for it.
That's one of those golden scenes that happens just because of the dynamic of the actors. I really think that Stilgar, he just added so much depth to that character that it carried every scene he was in.
And him and Josh Brolin are amazing because they're actually real life friends.
That's awesome.
And so their dynamic in this is phenomenal. They especially that scene, you could see it. They were just ribbing each other.
Yeah. And it's hard to even imagine Brolin in that kind of setting. But did you see him host SNL? Have you seen him host SNL?
No,
he did that recently as well. You should check that out. It was funny.
I'll have to watch that one. Yeah. But speaking of some context that was left out for the atomics that I think that maybe the audience would be interested in. Again, I haven't read the book, so I may be wrong on this, but I believe atomics, I am sure about this part, AI and robotics and that kind of stuff are outlawed. Atomics are also outlawed, but every major house stashed away some and hid them. Yeah, hid them from the Emperor as a backup in case, this happens.
Isn't it fascinating? You just touched on something like very gingerly that is an integral element of the Dune story, which is also bizarrely apt for our own culture at this exact moment and is talked about almost not at all in the new remakes, which is the dynamic of AI, of thinking machines, of machines that are built in the way of thinking, like a human. And it's this is really an interesting. I needed AI to say that better for me.
I agree, but I like how you got to that.
Hold on, let me get ChatGPT to say that better for me. No, but especially with what we're going through in our culture at this very moment, it's quite apropos, and yet has very little to do with the remake. Isn't that an interesting dynamic?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think it just speaks to Denis' ability to write a story that, I mean, obviously the Dune universe, Dune was written forever ago, but to adapt that and have it, not just with the AI, because that doesn't really come up in the movie, but to have that kind of so many mirroring storylines and elements that fit so well in our current political environment and, real life dynamics. And then, of course, obviously AI not being a part of the story, but also not being part of the original story because of it being banned and, the original AI jihad.
Yeah, exactly.
It's one of those sci-fi tropes that comes up over and over because of how terrified humanity is of destroying ourselves.
Indeed.
And it's going to happen.
It is. Another podcast, but yes.
Podcast. I don't know. We just don't seem to learn. We're so afraid of destroying ourselves, but we just make it so easy.
We do. Yeah.
But I mean, it's like you said, it's very apropos. It's amazing to see these storylines written way back then and then carried over now and still be so pivotal, so on point for what we're going through in today's world. And of course, that draws you into the universe more, right? Because it makes you, and that's the whole thing about sci-fi and most fantasy, I'd say, is taking, one of the key things that makes fantasy so appealing is taking things that we struggle with in real world and adapting it into a storyline in fantasy that draws us, that makes the world seem more real, right? Because, oh, look, they're dealing with things that we deal with too, like they're dealing with these struggles. They're on a grander scale. They're more fantastical. They're more, maybe amorphous in some ways, but the heart of it is still some of the same problems that we deal with as humans all the time.
Oh, couldn't agree more. And I would argue that is one of the, if not the greatest and strongest pillar that holds up science fiction as a genre as a whole. I think that not just that it mirrors something that we can relate to make it so that the story is still applicable and able to be empathized with by the audiences that are going to be watching it, but science fiction has this beautiful way of taking an issue that is really polarizing, really difficult in our contemporary society where we have a hard time talking about it, and removing it and putting it into a completely different lens. You take that same human issue and you remove it enough, just enough from our everyday lives and put it in this science fiction theater in a way that we can look at it objectively. I brought up Star Trek a little bit ago, and I would argue that is Star Trek's greatest strength and why it has become such an essential element in science fiction in our society today, is that the original Star Trek was famous for it. Every Star Trek is famous for it. You take a situation like racism in the 60s and then remove it, put it in the future, put it in a new frame of reference so that it's alien and it's not humans, like Star Trek was great. We're humans. We're past all of those issues, but we're going to find an alien planet that's dealing with it and show how silly it is from a different lens that we don't have to feel defensive about. Do you know what I mean? This is such an element of what makes science fiction so great.
Absolutely.
There are real elements here of, like you said, there's this white savior thing, there's this anti-hero thing, there's huge religious overtones. There's almost, and I brought this up to my wife on the way back home from the theater while we were watching it. I was like, if you looked at this movie as someone who had no connection to this whatsoever, you could see it being portrayed as like an overly dramatized, high fantasy portrayal of what maybe Catholicism and its garb and its prophecy would look like from the outside, or what the Muslim religion and practices would look like to someone from the outside. These elements are there. We're seeing these things. There's this new element that Denis is intentionally adding, a dramatically improved amount of cultural and racial diversity into the movie, into feminism and the portrayal of women in strong character roles, and yet it's all believable. It's all in world. It's done seamlessly in a way that does not engender any kind of bipartisanship, right? It's such an interesting thing where we can all see it. It's done healthily. It's done well, and everyone is enjoying it. And I think that, especially in 2024, is probably the tallest order that anyone could have in making a major motion picture today, is how to ride that line. And I think it was beautifully done. I can't even think of a lot of other things in the last 7 years that have really ridden that line in a really healthy way that make everybody pull back from whatever their social leanings are and enjoy this movie, seeing all of these positive elements being infused.
Yeah. Denis did it perfectly, absolutely perfectly. And we've seen in, especially recently with this kind of shift in the way movies are being produced and written, we've seen a lot of like shoving certain agendas in multiple directions, in multiple political views and opinions, but whatever the director or the writer's political one way or the other, or feelings, not even political, just feelings about certain topics, really pushing that in a movie.
To the detriment of the story.
To the detriment of the story. And Denis here, I'm sure he has his own feelings and opinions, but he treads the line beautifully and doesn't write his opinions into the movie and present it as the whole movie.
Oh, like you said, he does better showing than telling, right? He shows you instead of tells you.
And by showing instead of telling, you allow the audience to form their own opinions on what you're showing them. And those opinions can agree with you, disagree with you. That's the beauty of being human.
And of art, right? And interpreting art, because that's what it comes down to. These are artistic stories. So speaking of that element, especially since we were bringing up the strong female characters, would now be an okay time to segue into Dune Prophecy. Are you aware of Dune Prophecy?
Dune Prophecy.
One of the things that I have been utterly shocked about in the media sphere of Dune and the sort of like absolute rabid desire for more and more in this universe is how few people are talking about the fact that we are getting a TV series on Max akin to the style of House of Dragons that is going to appear on our streaming service this year. It's going to be fall of 2024. And I cannot believe how few people are talking about this.
I watched 3 podcasts about Dune Part 2, and only one of them, and for a brief moment, mentioned Dune Prophecy, which is why I completely forgot about it. It's crazy.
It has been blowing my mind. And even looking for the information myself, I feel like it's just sort of buried. And you'd think that it would be getting, because, and we're going to get to this very soon, Dune Awakening, the new MMORPG that is coming out soon, is certainly riding the wave of the positive feedback that this movie has been accumulating, and rightly so. It's what you would expect. I just don't feel like it is somehow attached to Dune Prophecy. And this is a really interesting thing. If those of you who are listening are unaware, effectively, the author of Dune, right, Frank Herbert, who wrote this in 1965, his son, Brian Herbert, wrote a bunch of other books in the Dune universe. So a whole series of prequels. There's been a whole bunch of spin-off things. He wrote all of them with another author named Kevin J. Anderson, who was sort of like a supplementary author on all of the books. And basically one of the prequels from his son is being converted into this show. That is the setting of this new series. And the setting is going to be 10,000 years before the events of Dune, which is why I made the connection between that and House of the Dragon, right? Because it is this sort of far removed but attached prequel to this grand story that we've been watching and loving for 60 years. And this story is going to basically dictate the rise and creation of the Bene Gesserit in the first place. The original novel was called Sisterhood of Dune, which was in fact the title of the show initially. This book, by the way, written only as recently as 2012.
Wow,
so
really?
He's still writing them. It's absolutely crazy. And in addition to this being made, some of the executive producers or like consulting producers on this series include both the son, Brian Herbert, and the granddaughter, Kim Herbert, who is also in on the making of this series. I think partly what could be responsible for some of the trepidation with the media is that, like, I'm going to throw another Star Trek thing out here, like we saw in Star Trek Discovery, it was a really highly anticipated addition to the franchise of Star Trek that we hadn't seen in a long time. There was a lot of hype behind it, but there was a lot of tribulation behind the scenes. There was a lot of back and forth, replacing talent, replacing directors, showrunners, script writers. It has been a mess. And if you go and look into it, and I encourage you to, it's very complicated. There's been a lot of people being replaced, leaving for unknown reasons. I'm not entirely sure. I can only speculate. I even hesitate to speculate. The reason why it sort of entered my thought process at this moment was because we were talking about sort of writing that fine line, and maybe why, it's sort of hard for movies to be financially successful today because of the really polarized social political landscape that we find ourselves in. And art, of course, reflecting culture as it does, finds itself more polarizing than it maybe has ever been in my lifetime in movies and TV series. So it's really difficult. I think that the success of Dune, the remake, and Dune Part 2, very masterfully writing that line that does not alienate any particular group of people. It's possible that played some sort of role in the architecture of this series. It was initially called Dune the Sisterhood. It is now called Dune Prophecy. There's extra elements that kind of are going in behind the scenes on how this is going to play out, but it is a really interesting addition to the universe of Dune that we're going to get very soon. I said at the beginning, we're not seeing Dune 3. Dune Messiah is going to be years down the road, but we only have to wait a few short months to get to the point where we're going to be seeing it on our screens at home.
So my question for why this has flown under the radar is, has it flown under the radar because it's getting all these changes and it's going to be better? Or has it flown under the radar because it hasn't been getting, and this could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, but it hasn't been getting support from Warner Brothers? If you've watched the first Dune Awakening behind the scenes video that they put out, they are getting a lot of support from Warner Brothers. Not Warner Brothers dictating to them, but Warner Brothers saying, you have access to everything from Dune 1 and Dune Part 2.
They flew out to the sets. They got to see it. Yeah. They were in person. I mean, I've loved the overlap, and we haven't gotten to Dune Awakening yet, but I absolutely love how connected that is. It made it very clear that the Dune game is going to be based not just on Dune, but on the Dune remakes by Denis, right? So like that is the most iconic element to take away from that. And it's true. How much of that is going to have an impact on Dune Prophecy is still up in the air. And one of the other important things to note about this was that Denis Villeneuve was going to direct this as well. He was the director for this initially and decided that too many other projects were going on, and it was concurrent basically with Dune 2, so there was just too much going on and he took a step back. But there's no way of knowing what goes on behind the scenes with this stuff.
I feel like the timing is the biggest thing because he does have a lot going on, right? I feel like I can buy that, whereas most times I don't. Like most times I'm like, I don't buy that. But I will say I'm surprised that if it really was going well and he just didn't have the time, I'm surprised he didn't take a producer role, right?
Yeah, and he may have, actually. I'll have to look into that. I know that several other of the people that were showrunner, or a couple of them, I think, stayed on as like some sort of consulting role. I'm not sure exactly where that's going to go, but...
Because one of the producers from Dune Part 2 is directly helping out with, I might be wrong, but I believe from watching the video that he's directly helping out with the game, Dune Awakening, and they have artists that are doing mock-ups for them from the movie.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, so like, obviously they have to do their own art and their own models and stuff, but they're getting assistance from the actual people that worked on the movies, which is just like, I not to segue into the game too early, but I have not been more excited for an MMO in a long time. Hey, thanks for watching Coffee Break. This episode was brought to you by viewers like you. If you want to support us, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you want to see more. Don't forget to check us out on your favorite podcasting platforms and leave a comment below with your thoughts on all things Dune. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2 of this discussion where we dive into the Dune Awakening MMO. And we'll see you when we see you.